Hey, okay, I think we are live here, Jack, at
Yeah.
Athenian Day 2025. Thank you very much for joining us. Jack and everybody that's um, on this webinar. I'm Adrian Camara. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of Athennian. I'm excited to welcome Jack Newton, the CEO and founder of Clio, for an intimate conversation with the Athenian community. Just a little bit of background on Jack. Jack co-founded Clio in 2008. Clio has grown into one of the most successful legal technology companies ever. I believe now the largest practice management platform globally with over 200,000 legal professionals using it around the world. I believe a billion of capital raised, Jack,
Over a billion now. Yep.
over a billion. Is that USD or Canadian?
Always USD. It's the only
Always.
currency I think
Jack
in.
and I are both Canadian. We have to clarify that. It's a trick. Sometimes Canadians use Canadian dollars to make the numbers look bigger. Um, Clio announced in June a $1 billion acquisition of VLEX. That's I believe the largest private legal tech acquisition
That's right. Largest legal tech acquisition in history.
in history. Nice. And then that is the largest global collection of case law and legal data sort of corpus globally. And that's going to fuel Clio's AI roadmap. So yeah, I think you started Clio in '08. I started Athenian in 17, 18. So, I think you've been at it for nearly 2 decades. I've been nearly at it for nearly a decade. So between the two of us, it's nearly 3 decades of building software for legal and all this, the associated folks in tax and finance and operations that work alongside legal. Um,
How do you
so
still have hair, Adrian?
how do I still have hair? Yeah, I know. You know what? It's good genes. It's good genes. Yeah, it's really good genes. We're gonna keep it casual today. Jack just rolled off of a red eye from San Francisco to New York. That's one of the benefits of no hair is you can roll off a plane and hop right on a webinar
Yeah,
like this.
my hair care regime is very quick.
So we want this conversation to be very interactive. There's a Q&A box. If you have any questions, please pop it in. We'll stop, we'll answer. Um, and yeah, I think today we're going to cover a wide variety of topics. The origin stories of Clio. We might talk a little bit about the origin story of Athenian, the future of enterprise legal software, and of course, AI. So let's hop right into it. Um, so Jack, I'd love to hear like a little bit of the background on Clio. You started Clio in 2008. What was the world like as an upstart legal technology company in 2008?
I mean, just to set the stage, in 2008, Steve Jobs had just announced the first iPhone. Every lawyer was walking around with a BlackBerry and saying, "You'll pry this thing out of my cold dead hands." Dropbox was just announced in 2008, so that was a brand new product in 2008. So the technology landscape in 2008 was very much on-premise software. Practice management software at the time was Amicus Attorney and Time Matters and PC Law. And the idea of moving to the cloud was something we were starting to see emerging in other industries. Salesforce.com was a few years into its journey and building building a CRM for sales professionals. But when Clio launched in 2008 as the world's first cloud-based legal practice management system, it was both a revolutionary idea and I would say also a heretical idea. Like we had people telling us we were not only crazy, but encouraging malpractice by telling lawyers they could store data in the cloud and so on. So we had a real uphill battle, but we took it
Did
with
you guys get sued by the bar associations like LegalZoom? It didn't go that far,
we
did it?
never got sued. We never got sued, but
That's
we
good.
certainly had a lot of people, accusing us of endorsing and promoting a computing model that they didn't think was compatible with lawyers' professional obligations. And we did a lot in those first 5, 10 years even to educate the legal industry around the security and ethics of cloud computing and so on. And cut to 17 short years later, I think finally the cloud is generally accepted best practice. You're now viewed as a bit of a dinosaur if you're using on-premise systems. And if you're looking to unlock the opportunity of AI, cloud is table stakes, right? Like you need to
Yeah.
have your data in the cloud to leverage AI. So that's another, big tailwind along with COVID-19 was another, definitely a secular tailwind that helped drive cloud adoption. And as you mentioned in the opening today, today Clio's the largest legal technology platform in the world. We have over 200,000 legal professionals on the platform. We just announced Clio for Enterprise at ClioCon, and I know you've seen the opening keynote, Adrian. We could maybe post a link to it as well for anyone that wants to go in depth on some of the things I'll talk about today. But the the expansion of the enterprise is something we're really excited about. And we started out, maybe the last thing I'll comment about the historical progression is, when we launched in 2008, we were really laser focused on solos and then very small firms, 2, 3, 5-person firms. And we've just over 17 years been relentlessly iterating on the software to bring it to larger and larger markets. And as of 2 weeks ago, planted a flag in the enterprise space, which we really define as the um, 20 to 200 lawyer law firms.
Hi, how are you? Oh, thank you. Oh, you had somebody at the door?
Yeah, sorry about that. All
No
good.
worries. And does that include in-house legal departments as well, or is it just law firms?
No, that's a great question. And it definitely does include in-house legal departments. So in 2000 and, or sorry, in Q2 of this year, we acquired a company called ShareDo. That's a really compelling work automation and matter management platform used by both in-house counsel and large legal teams at AmLaw 200 firms. So Clio, I would say, has over its growth path really done a great job of addressing everyone from solos up to 200-person firms. And with this acquisition of ShareDo, which we now call Clio Operate, we rebranded that 2 weeks ago as well. Clio Operate really solves for the needs of 200 to 2,000 plus person law firms, as well as small to large legal departments and in-house counsel teams. The second acquisition we made, as you mentioned in the opening, was of VLEX and their world-class data platform and their data platform that competes very favorably with the likes of Thomson Reuters and LexisNexis, and the world-class AI platform that they've built on that called Vincent, which competes with the likes of Harvey and Legora. But the key differentiator for Vincent is it's grounded in this huge breadth and depth of legal data, the billion documents that are part of the VLEX library that span over 110 countries. So that is something we are super excited about bringing to the enterprise market. And again, both in-house legal teams and uh, corporate, or sorry, both in-house legal teams, corporate legal departments, and law firms really benefit from and will leverage this software heavily.
Yeah. I want to go back to something you said earlier around when you were first launching Clio in the, I think it's called the aughts, right? Like the single digit 2000,
Yes. Yeah,
the
the odds.
aughts.
Yeah.
Um, that the mainstream view was that cloud software for legal was heretical. Criticisms were, not ethical, violated ethical obligations, and security obligations. And that, when we think about, that was the criticism, that was sort of the headline commentary from the institutions to where we are, from on-prem, pen and paper to cloud. That sounds, we're hearing about, similar commentary and criticism as we're thinking about AI, right? And all the criticisms around, hallucinations and if I upload some material, is it going to is somebody else going to be able to access it in another
Right.
chat, or does it appear in a Google search? And it's just it's interesting how um, the history sort of rhymes, or
Yes.
even repeats itself here. It's always a little bit different. I think the criticisms I think might be a little bit more valid this time with AI than it was with cloud, because there are some real tangible concerns there, and real tangible examples. But it's just interesting to sort of see that sort of pattern repeat as we're going through another technology paradigm shift.
Totally agree. One of my favorite quotes is from Mark Twain, who says exactly that. History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And I think what we see with AI is definitely an echo of what we saw with the cloud. I do think the difference is one of the things we really don't appreciate about AI, that I don't think is discussed widely enough, is when you really boil down what the cloud delivered, it was uniformly superior to what on-premise offered. People talked about security
Yep,
of cloud, but then you compared it to the security of most on-premise systems, which was in
totally.
shambles, and it was
Yeah,
dramatically better.
yeah,
What I think is under discussed with AI is you have some of these, just embedded and intractable flaws in the way LLMs work with hallucinations, for example, that you need to understand these are a side effect of these really sophisticated AI models, and they're inherent. And OpenAI just published a research paper saying these are basically deeply embedded in the fundamental models of LLMs, and we can't expect that hallucinations will just go away. So this idea, I think what needs to change is our mental model of how we approach computing needs to change, because basically for 25 years with Google and Wikipedia and Excel, you name it, we've learned to trust the tools we use on computers deeply and basically expect the answers they give back to us are correct 99.999% of the time. You don't ask Google a question or look up something on Wikipedia or do a calculation in Excel and get an incorrect answer very often at all, right? But with
yeah,
with 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 generative AI, you need to um, really accommodate that. You need to shift that mental model to appreciate the fact that, like, look, these hallucinations are inherent, and then you need to check your work. It's kind of the Ronald Reagan trust but verify mantra, and that's where having your data, having your AI rooted in high quality data is so important, because then you can go and verify. It can cite where it's getting the answers from, and you can verify that it's leveraging the right kind of data in giving you the answers. So back to your question, you see a lot of the same patterns in some of the concerns folks have about AI. I think what is also very different about cloud versus AI is cloud, I felt like, and you were in this boat too, Adrian, it felt for a long time we were kind of selling the cloud, right? Like pitching the value
yep,
proposition of the cloud, and
yep.
hopefully,
I remember talking to some of our early customers, talking to them about how the cloud is actually more secure than on-prem, and I'd point towards their one server in the closet and talking about, what happens if there's a fire? What happens if there's a flood? What happens if somebody breaks into your office? And like actually having, pictures of AWS data centers that have
right,
military grade physical security around them, because you have, bank
right.
data, healthcare
Compared
data.
to a server in a broom closet that's not locked, like that.
Yeah,
That's what we're up against. But AI, the difference with AI though is, I think law firms and lawyers instinctively realize how transformative this technology is. They're pulling it in really aggressively and adopting it rapidly, but they
Yeah.
need to be eyes wide open about some of these,
Yeah.
some of these risks and some of the, again, how you just need to evolve your mental model of how this era of computing is different than what we saw with basically every other type of computing we've had for the last 25 years.
Yeah. So when we think about like when I was watching um your keynote presentation at ClioCon last, I think it was last week, right?
2 weeks
And
ago now, I think.
okay,
So,
2 weeks ago, yeah, in
yeah.
Boston. And something jumped out at me that you were talking about that's really relevant to a concept that we have at Athenian called governance operations. And that's really how we think about the value that we deliver to our customers is very much around aligning legal, tax, finance, compliance, operations teams around this very complex corporate structure that our customers are automating that tends to be global. Responsibility of managing it is often federated to different teams. um, and how AI can help drive alignment. And that's really that concept of governance operations, aligning all those teams. And you were talking a lot in your presentation about this concept of context engineering and helping Clio users and Clio customers. You just have this, and this is really a feature of this sort of, legal, finance, tax, compliance world where there's just a million dots. And how do you connect all those dots? And you're operating across so many different projects, and they're very multidisciplinary, and you often have counterparties. Um, how AI and technology can help relieve the cognitive load on on our customers, on the users, on the of software. And I'll raise one example of where things can go really bad, right? If that alignment and those dots aren't connected, right? Oftentimes we'll have when organizations come to us, oftentimes seeking to partner with us and access our technology, oftentimes something's gone very wrong. And that's the catalyst for, okay, we need to invest in this and improve this function. And a lot of the time what's gone wrong is just these teams have not been aligned, and a decision's being made because there was a lack of context. And a really good example is we had a very global company that came to us, and tax was big. Global tax is based in London. The tax team had identified a certain structure that if they reorganized that structure would create certain tax benefits. And so they reorganized that structure. That involved dissolving some entities and moving some boxes around on the chart. What they were not aware of was some of those entities were named in U.S. class action litigation that were dissolved, and that created a massive shit show for the legal team, right?
Right.
And that's just that alignment across and the awareness of this massive sort of array of dots. So I'd love to hear some more depth, right, on like how you're thinking about context engineering at Clio and what that
Yeah,
means.
it's a great question. And maybe, one of the really important concepts I think for people to understand is the more context you can give your AI, the better it can support the questions you're asking and help better support the actions you're taking and flag maybe actions that might be dangerous. So the really key idea that we announced in this keynote at ClioCon a couple weeks ago is the idea of what we describe as an intelligent legal work platform. And this is really the concept that you can wrap AI with all the context of your matters. And when you do that, you can access all the emails, you can access all the activities, you can access all the documents and so on that have been uploaded to that matter. And then furthermore, Clio's AI is able to root its reasoning in this massive VLEX database of 1 billion legal documents. So you've got this huge swath of information, both about your practice and your matters, as well as the law to do this legal reasoning. And so this concept of context engineering is not specific to Clio, by the way, but in the context of Athenian, if you had kind of that graph of your organizations and your various companies, and you had the context of a database of all the open legal issues that might be open against those entities, your AI would be able to flag any issues with shutting down that entity and help guide you through a path of navigating that without creating the kind of shit show you described. And so I think
Yeah.
what's really key is this idea that I think are systems of record. And Athenian I would describe as a system of record. Clio is a system of record. There are these sources of truth that you go for, the truth about entity management, or you go to for the truth about the status of your matters in Clio. They're evolving into what I describe as systems of action. And the idea of a system of action is it can start taking actions on your behalf. It can synthesize the knowledge in your practice, the knowledge embedded in your systems like Athenian and like Clio, and help you execute actions, help flag, in the scenario you outlined, help flag what might be dangerous actions. And it's where AIs can just become these we call them teammates almost, but these agents that are able to support you in your work and help you avoid mistakes, and for some of the types of tasks you're executing on, help avoid some of the toil. They'll just help automate huge parts of your day away for you, so you can focus on what you love.
Yeah, I think the idea of, here's all our entities and here's all the matters across, a global basis that are linked to those entities. I think that as a vision, I think probably gets the audience on this call really excited. Because a lot of that linking is done manually right now, or it's
Exactly.
just, again, the context is in somebody's mind and they need to be in the
And
street.
sometimes you're talking about, thousands of entities and this
Oh yeah.
very graph of how they're interconnected.
Yep.
And, that's the
Yep.
kind of thing that, you talk about cognitive load. One thing I'll mention as a quick aside is we just published our newest legal trends report, and it's something you can get for free. If you just Google Clio legal trends report, you'll get a download link for that report. But in that report, we did our the first ever in legal history study of brain activity when using AI. So we actually partnered with a brain science company
You
that
like
hooked
put
up.
like nets on your users?
Yeah, exactly. Like we did exactly
Wow.
that and studied how Clio and AI in Clio
Wow.
helped impact things like cognitive load and
And what were
stress.
the results?
The results were that exactly to what I think you were, correctly guessing at is AI can dramatically lower your cognitive load and help you focus on kind of the high intensity reasoning tasks that you want to
Yep.
focus on. So it's a fascinating
Yep.
study that I'd encourage people to check out.
Yeah. So when we talk about, like, when I think about, like, there's the impact of AI on how work gets done. Um, but there's also there's also this bubbling commentary around what's the impact of AI on the people who do the work, right? We're talking a little bit about that now, but also in terms of what's the skill set that's required, how does this impact talent markets, right? And I think we're starting to see some of the early innings around, um, organizations, banks, law firms, um, aren't, they're starting to reduce the amount of junior talent they need because you have AI systems that can do a lot of the work that, junior legal, tax, finance, talent, does. And when I reflect on what I did as a junior lawyer in a law firm, um, a heck of a lot of it. I mean, a lot of it could have been automated without the AI stuff, like, just like,
Right.
it's like transaction management,
Yeah.
software, like uh, there's been a lot of 3 a.m., 4 a.m. Adrian, you know, uh, editing, versioning up and redlining 300 documents that can now be automated just because one variable changed.
Yeah.
Um, and so, I guess, how do we think about like the supply and the demand, right? You know, of, of work and of talent.
Yeah. So maybe I'll start out saying I'm very optimistic about the impact AI is going to have on legal teams, both whether you're practicing in a law firm or your in-house counsel. I think AI is going to uh, have a very positive impact on quality of life for lawyers and legal professionals more broadly. As you were pointing out, Adrian, like those early lawyer careers are full of a lot of toil, and
Yes.
the
That's a
kind of
reason.
toil.
It's the reason I'm not a lawyer right now.
Right. And the kind of toil that, AI makes completely unnecessary. And I think what I've seen as a trend in the employment market for young lawyers is they're demanding to work at firms that leverage AI because they don't want to do that work. They want to focus on higher quality, higher impact work. And they're actually choosing the firm they want to work with based on the technologies they have, which I think is a kind of first in history kind of development that the technology stack a law firm uses is helping determine what kind of talent it can attract. The other trend that I see is there's a lot of gnashing of teeth about is this a zero sum game? Is AI going to replace labor and employment for young lawyers and other types of regardless of seniority going to eventually decrease? I take a very positive sum view of the opportunity here and think, it's really AI enabled lawyers that will be replacing lawyers that are trying to pretend AI is not happening. That's the threat you need to worry about.
Right.
But the AI leveraging lawyers are going to open up so much opportunity for themselves. And the statistic I always ground my argument in when I'm talking about this is the World Justice Project stat that 77% of legal demand is unmet by lawyers. So the legal market that addresses that 23% of demand that is actually served by lawyers is a $1 trillion a year market globally.
Yeah.
And I think with AI, we're going to be able to dramatically reduce the cost of delivering legal services. We're going to be able to dramatically improve the quality of those legal services concurrently. And anytime you do that, anytime technology has done that over the last 100 years, whether it's the assembly line for the automobile or the mechanical loom for textiles, or you name the technology, this is like the Industrial Revolution for legal. And it's going
Yep.
to lower the marginal cost of delivering legal services, and in turn, that will expand the size of the total addressable market or the TAM
Yep.
for legal. And that is there's a $4 trillion legal TAM for the taking and a $3 trillion latent legal market for the taking for law firms that try to navigate how to price and package and deliver their services in an innovative way and leverage AI in an effective way to do that. And that holds for in-house legal teams as well. There's so much demand for legal services inside companies. It's served in such a, I would say, like uniform and unsegmented way today, and AI can really dramatically amplify and accelerate the impact that in-house lawyers can have as well. So ultimately, I'm very optimistic. There's no shortage of work uh,
Yeah.
to be done here, and ultimately AI will help us address more of that demand.
Yeah. I think one of my first principles that I approach here, which I think you're describing, is in free markets, as transaction costs come down, the volume of transactions go up.
That's exactly right.
That's just what happens. And I was talking to one of my friends that is a that's an employment lawyer, in-house, at a big company. And his comment to me was, our our first assumption was, our first assumption was that AI would reduce the amount of work that we would be doing because we have
Right.
AI reading, demand letters and all this type of stuff. It's actually increased it because every time we fire somebody, they go to Chat GPT And, we get, demand letters, from ChatGPT, and they're demanding more, severance and,
Exactly.
making all these claims and so on. And so, I think, there's an interesting way. Sometimes it takes time, but first principle of free markets is as transaction costs go down, transaction volumes go up. I think for this audience, thinking about things like, KYC requests and audits that really hammer this, the folks inside of companies that manage entities. Um, as it gets cheaper for the organizations, the transaction costs come down for organizations to KYC you or to audit you. The volume of
Yep.
those KYC requests and audits are going to go up.
That's right. And you'll see that pattern across the economy.
Yep. Jack, we're at time. We have our 2026 product roadmap session starting. I want to thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for
I know
having me. It was a
you're
great
busy.
conversation.
Yeah, closing transactions and taking your red eye flights. But thank you very much for spending the time with our team and our community at Athenian.
Thanks for having me, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Adrian. Thanks, everyone.